Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
President Trump's Board of Peace holds its first meeting, even as he assembles the biggest military buildup since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. That, of course, happening as we speak in the Middle East. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Thanks for being with us on this little Friday edition. Kailey, the president's talking peace today, but he's got Georgia on his mind. He just got on Air Force One on his way to Rome as the White House pivots to affordability.
Yeah, two areas of focus for the president today, one abroad and one here at home, which is where his chief of staff, Susie Wiles, would probably prefer his attention really be targeted as we get closer and closer to the midterms. Yes, he is going to Rome, specifically to the old district of former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, with whom he, of course, has had a famous falling out. I'm not sure how much of his remarks will be targeted at the woman he now calls Marjorie Trader Greene, and how much he's going to stick to the script on prices and what the American people are experiencing.
Well, that's the whole point, is to stick to the script. And of course, the Weave can get to a lot of different topics. He's been awfully busy today with a group of world leaders here in Washington, not the ones you might suspect to join a president of the United States on the Board of Peace. Jared Kushner was there. We're coming off of Iran and Ukraine talks, Kailey, and of course, still beating the drum with more military equipment arriving in, even as we speak, in the Middle East. We're going to have a lot to talk about coming up straight ahead this hour.
Yes, we will. We're going to be joined by Meghan O'Sullivan, former Deputy National Security Advisor during the George W. Bush administration at the time of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which is the last time we saw military hardware and assets going to the Middle East at this scale, which may tell you something about what could happen within the next 10 days if President Trump is to be believed.
A 10-day window that we're looking at. The UN watchdog saying that window for diplomacy is closing as we speak. And you're right, she was instrumental in arranging that invasion and creating the surge strategy that followed several years later. So this is going to be an interesting conversation coming up.
Indeed it will. And of course, it has market implications too. We certainly saw that in oil yesterday, again today. So let's get a check on that and other asset classes as we turn to Nora Melinda up in New York. Hey, Nora.
Hey, Kailey. We check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. U.S. stocks falling as heightened geopolitical worries pressured sentiment. We see the S&P 500 is down just about 0.6%. That tech-heavy NASDAQ 100 down about 0.7%. And the blue chip Dow Jones Industrial Average down 0.8%. We see financials and information technology the worst performing sectors in the broader market in that S&P 500. And utilities and energy stocks the best performing group. Taking a look at the volatility in the market, we do see the VIX hanging just around that 21 handle, just below 21 right now. We do see the yield on the benchmark 10-year Treasury right now just below 4.1%. That policy-sensitive 2-year Treasury yield at 3.5%. Oil jumping. The rising risk of an attack in the Middle East is impairing risk appetite near term, with over 350 firms in the S&P 500 falling. And we're keeping an eye still on those treasuries. But let's look at West Texas Intermediate crude, because we do see that at $66.62 per barrel. Gold and silver both advancing. We see gold up about 0.2% at $49.86, while spot silver at $77.63. Bitcoin today lower, down about 0.1% at that $66,000 handle. And digging into some of the individual movers, I'm keeping an eye on Walmart. Shares lower. The company did, though, issue a full-year earnings forecast that fell short of Wall Street estimates. The retailer citing the need for flexibility amid unpredictable times for consumers. And Deere shares climbing for double-digit gains. That's after the company boosted its annual profit outlook, anticipated a long-awaited upturn in the agriculture economy. The company increased its outlook for small agriculture and turf, as well as construction and forestry. And lastly, Klarna shares plunging, a brutal day for them. Less than 6 months after its IPO, it's reported 2 consecutive quarters of losses and is struggling to convince investors to hold on for future profit. Shares of Klarna down about 27% as we speak. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Nora Melinda, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Bloomberg's Nora Melinda in New York, thank you so much. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu here in Washington, D.C., where I have to say traffic was pretty abysmal this morning, in large part thanks to the gathering that was taking place at the Donald J. Trump Institute of Peace. Whether or not it's going to remain named that probably is going to depend on the outcome of what's happening in courts of law after he effectively seized it last year. The question, of course, though, that was being visited beyond the name of the building, inside the building, was the rebuilding of Gaza and the role the various members and signatories to the Board of Peace will play in that. President Trump announcing today that the United States will be providing $10 billion in the aid of rebuilding Gaza. Other nations on the Board of Peace will be providing $7 billion. And he described the mission as an incredibly important global one that could extend well beyond Gaza. Here's a taste of what President Trump said this morning.
I believe it's the most consequential board, certainly in terms of power and in terms of prestige. There's never been anything close, because these are the greatest world leaders. Almost everybody's accepted, and the ones that haven't will be. And some are playing a little cute. It doesn't work. You can't play cute with me.
The Institute of Peace on the west side of D.C., a very short walk from the Potomac River, which at the moment apparently smells like sewage. So that was the atmosphere for these world leaders. And we want to start ahead of our conversation with Meghan O'Sullivan with an update from the White House. Bloomberg White House correspondent Skylar Woodhouse joins us right now from the North Lawn. This is interesting, Skylar. About 60 invitations sent to heads of state around the world. Only about 24 countries have agreed to join, and they are not the countries that you might expect. Who sits on this board?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing with this board is it's pretty in line with President Trump as a person. He's going the non-traditional route as he tries to establish this Board of Peace. Today, we had the president of Argentina. You had representatives from Morocco, Czech Republic, Israel, Azerbaijan. So you had Armenia. You had representatives from, countries that don't traditionally are at the forefront of peace conversations as the president tries to make this sort of a dupe of the United Nations. And one thing that we were watching today, as the president has hinted at a potential attack to Iran, was this going to come up in conversation today? The president didn't offer any new details on what he plans to do, but it was definitely something that folks are watching as he really tries to lean into peace in the Middle East.
Yeah, peace or perhaps lack thereof, depending on what happens 10 days from now. I guess, Skylar, as he said, that's when we'll find out whether or not diplomacy can win out in Iran. As we think, though, about the geopolitical elements of which President Trump has been largely focused as of late, obviously, there are forces within the White House, including the Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, who are hoping to narrow the focus back on domestic issues ahead of the midterms. Hence, the trip to Georgia today that the president is literally on board the plane about to take off for Rome, Georgia, to talk about affordability. To what extent is this just a preview, Skylar, of what he's going to say at the State of the Union on Tuesday?
Yeah, well, Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, I mean, she has aides around the White House, not just herself, but they have really been trying to push the president to talk about affordability as the November midterms are just around the corner. I know it might seem like it's a couple months or it's just months away, but it's going to come very quickly. And Republicans are trying to crack down on their affordability message. Obviously, with the president's tariffs, higher costs, they're trying to figure out how they can best get their message to voters. And like you mentioned, Kailey, at the top of the show, this is former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. So this will be an interesting speech for President Trump. It'll be interesting to see, does he just sling shot after shot on the former Congresswoman, or does he stick to the script and really lean into affordability as he talks about housing? He's also expected to visit a local business, and he's going to tour a steel factory. So he's trying to get out there and essentially talk to the people. But I mean, with President Trump, you never know which way the script might go. He could lean into affordability or take it a total different direction.
Well, that is very true indeed. Skylar Woodhouse reporting for us live from the White House. Thank you so much. Meantime, President Trump did speak with reporters on the tarmac before boarding Air Force One en route to Georgia, once again saying that, quote, really bad things will happen if there's no Iran deal. It echoes what we heard from him earlier today, speaking at the Institute of Peace.
Iran is a hot spot right now, and they're meeting, and they have a good relationship with the representatives of Iran, and, good talks are being had. It's proven to be, over the years, not easy to make a meaningful deal with Iran. We have to make a meaningful deal. Otherwise, bad things happen. But we have to make a meaningful deal. Now we may have to take it a step further, or we may not. Maybe we're going to make a deal. You're going to be finding out over the next probably 10 days.
So So for more, we turn to Meghan O'Sullivan, former Deputy National Security Advisor during the George W. Bush administration, now Director of the Harvard Belfer Center, here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Meghan, thank you so much for being here. I guess I have a few questions based strictly off what President Trump said. First, to have a meaningful deal, is 10 days enough time?
Well, I think it depends on how you define meaningful. If you look at the deal that the Trump administration fashioned around Gaza, that was a meaningful deal, but it was short on details. And so that could be what President Trump has in mind. If he's thinking of a meaningful deal like the deal that the Obama administration, the JCPOA, did with Iran many years ago, that was a document over 1,000 pages long, many months, years in the making. That kind of thing is not obviously possible. The Iranians are used to negotiating, haggling over every detail, and the pace and the pressure with which the Trump administration and the president in particular want to see actions and deals made. These two things are very much at odds with one another, and certainly a 10-day time frame could allow for a deal in principle, but certainly won't allow for a detailed scope.
Meghan, it's good to see you, and I'm glad you're back with us on this day of days. I'm seeing 2003 mentioned in stories all over the terminal and all over the internet today. The biggest military buildup since the invasion that you helped to prepare, the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Have we ever seen this much hardware assembled in one place without it being used?
Sure, and I should say that I was there. I went to Kuwait before the invasion of Kuwait, but at the time I was reasonably junior, but certainly I was there for it and part of it. This, as you pointed out, this is the largest military buildup of American force and firepower that the world has seen since 2003. And I think it really raises questions about what kind of action could the Trump administration be preparing. Certainly, this wouldn't be the first time that the Trump administration, or President Trump, I should say, would be using force in Iran. But the nature of this buildup and the lack of clarity around exactly what the objective would be in this particular use of force, I think is adding to some of the insecurity around the moment, is adding to the global jitters. Also, the questions around Iran's retaliation. I think in the past, what we've seen, whether it was the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in the first Trump administration or the strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities last summer, those were very specific and targeted military actions, and Iranian response was quite contained. I think the possibility is real that we'd be looking at something that was larger, more uncertain, and less contained. Of course, as President Trump made clear today, there's still the possibility of a deal on the table, and it could continue to be the case that this show of military force is to increase the pressure on the Iranians, because no doubt there's still a large gap between the U.S. and Iran on what each side would like to see in a deal.
Well, and so certainly there is some flexing happening, Meghan, of America's military might. But to your point on potential retaliation from Iran, what military might does Iran have right now, knowing that we did do damage back in June with the first strike? What is their capability to respond? Where do you think Iran could target?
Sure, Kailey, thanks for that question. First of all, your viewers should have no doubt that the U.S. is militarily superior in every dimension that is meaningful in a long-term sense here. Where Iran still does have capabilities, it still has missile capabilities, and that is one of the issues that the Trump administration would like to see, and the Israelis and others would like to see be part of a deal, which hasn't been the case in the past deal that has been solely related to nuclear issues. So it still has some missile capabilities, and that would likely be the focus of any initial American strike. What is causing concern is that Iran's remaining capabilities could still have an impact on America's Gulf friends and partners. So the region, I think, feels on edge and very vulnerable. There's also Iran, as your viewers will know, staged a military exercise in the Straits of Hormuz. That is, of course, also making people quite nervous, because that's, of course, where 20% of the world's daily oil consumption passes through that strait. Now, when we've seen the military action that I referred to earlier unfold in the Gulf over the last months and even years, but particularly in the last year, all that military operation didn't really raise the price of oil because it didn't disrupt supplies. Something that brought conflict into the Gulf and particularly into the Straits of Hormuz would certainly disrupt supplies. And the markets are telling us that they really do distinguish between military force and military force that disrupts oil supplies.
Meghan, we talked about your experience in 2003. 4 years later, you are credited with being one of the original advocates of the surge strategy. And I'm wondering what your advice would be to the administration when it comes to the day after conversation. What are they mapping out for scenarios, and what should they be prepared for?
Well, I think this gets to the point I made earlier about what is the objective that the Trump administration would be seeking. There's several objectives that they may embrace, and it's not entirely clear to someone who's not involved in the internal discussions. You know, certainly one objective could feasibly be regime change, and that makes it akin to the American action in 2003 that got rid of Saddam Hussein from Iraq. Now, in the last year, President Trump has demonstrated the kind of an allergy to that kind of intervention because of the really open-endedness of that. And certainly that is one of the scenarios that I think deserves very significant attention, is what would happen if one of two things happened. What would happen if U.S. military force was targeting the regime, the supreme leader, elements of the IRGC that brought about a regime collapse? Now, certainly my experience in Iraq and that of many, many other Americans and our coalition allies was that collapse takes a very, very long time to rebuild, to reconstitute, and opens up a security vacuum that can have a lot of unanticipated consequences. So I find it hard to manage that a collapse of the regime wouldn't require a much more robust American engagement in Iran for potentially a much longer period, something way beyond, I think, the American people are interested in right now. Whether the Trump administration has had a relationship with some members of the IRGC that could take over and something that would be more seamless and less disruptive is only probably known to the president and his closest advisors.
Well, so Meghan, it sounds like you're saying in our final minute here that there is a risk that we accidentally tumble into another, if not forever war, forever presence.
You know, I think there is a risk. I wouldn't say it is the central risk right now. My guess is if we look at President Trump's his propensity to use military force, it has always been quite targeted for a specific objective without the intention to get involved over the longer term. And so my near-term expectation would be, first, a real push for a deal. I don't take the 10-day window to be definitive. Certainly there's been flexibility on timing on a lot of these conflicts. So look at Ukraine, which was going to be solved, you know, in the hours running up to the inauguration. So I think the desire for a deal is going to be real. It depends if the Iranians can show more flexibility. Secondly, if there is military force, I think it'll go after the ballistic missiles. I think the idea that the Trump administration would want to topple the regime without any real prospect for stabilizing the country is something that I think is a risk, but not the largest risk that we are exposed to right now.
Meghan, we'd like to stay close to you for the next 10 days as we figure this out. Really appreciate your insights. Meghan O'Sullivan, former Deputy National Security Advisor in the George W. Bush administration. She's now at the Harvard Belfer Center, where she is director. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey, Leinz in Washington. We'll assemble our political panel next with a lot to talk about this Thursday on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg. Make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast. To hear our full conversation with Meghan O'Sullivan, go to Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Watch us live on YouTube and listen anytime at Bloomberg.com.
It's 1:21 p.m. here on Wall Street. We check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. I'm Nora Melinda. U.S. stocks are falling as tensions with Iran put traders on edge. You got the S&P 500 sliding about 0.7% lower, while the NASDAQ Composite Index also slides just about the same. And the blue chip Dow Jones Industrial Average down 0.9%. The VIX taking a look at the volatility hanging just around that 21 handle, while the yield on the benchmark 10-year Treasury yield sits at 4.1%. And the policy-sensitive 2-year Treasury yield at 3.5%. Taking a look at oil, the risk of an attack in the Middle East is impairing risk appetite near term. We're seeing oil jumping. Taking a look at West Texas Intermediate crude at $66.32 per barrel. We see gold and silver also on the rise. At gold sitting at $49.81, while pot silver is at $77.68. And Bitcoin, we see that today up as well, up about 0.4% after a 2-day slump, trading today just above that $66,000 level. And digging into some of the individual movers under the hood, we see booking shares in Focus down about 8%. This after the company reported better than expected first quarter bookings, indicating continued strength across the travel industry. The company also announced a 25-to-1 stock split and expectations of a $400 million in incremental revenue this year. And moving over to DoorDash, the largest food delivery service in the U.S. is rising after its outlook for orders in the current quarter beat Wall Street expectations. And lastly, shares of eBay and Focus up about 5%. This after the company agreed to buy Depop for about $1.2 billion. The goal being attracting younger shoppers and standing out in an increasingly cluttered e-commerce market. And we do see all these things really in focus right now. Gold still on the mind, of course, just circling back to that West Texas Intermediate crude right now at 66.32. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Nora Melinda, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Nora Melinda, checking the markets in New York. Thank you so much. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu here in Washington, where President Trump no longer is. He departed earlier this hour en route now to Georgia, specifically to the former district of former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. Probably not a coincidence, given the fallout between the president and someone who was once one of his most loyal allies in Congress. But his message that he will be bringing there, regardless of district, is one that he's hoping to take across the whole country, at least if Susie Wiles, his chief of staff, has her way, which is a message around affordability, something we also expect him to focus on at the State of the Union next week. Perhaps this speech today will be a preview of the speech on Tuesday, though he also gave us another preview of the speech on Tuesday when he spoke yesterday.
Watch the State of the Union. We're going to be talking about the economy. We inherited a mess, and now we have prices way down. We have energy way down. Gasoline is now breaking $2 a gallon in many places, and it's been actually amazing.
So President Trump is on his way now. And of course, we've got a speech set for a bit later on that actually may coincide with the late edition of Balance of Power, which starts at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Coosa Steel Corporation is where this is going to be happening, right across the street from the Darlington softball field. And the president will be talking in his element, as we always hear. He's happier on the road. The question is, will he deliver the message? Will he stick to the script on a day that began with a meeting of the president's Board of Peace and has been consumed by talk of a potential strike against Iran? This is where we start today with our political panel. Republican strategist Maura Gillespie is back with us. Founder and president of Bluestack Strategies, Doug Farrar, Democratic strategist, is with us as well. Principal at Maywood Strategies and former senior advisor to FTC Commissioner Lina Khan. It's great to have you both with us. Maura, what's your expectation? Because the tour was sidelined a bit, the affordability tour. At one point, we heard he'd be traveling every week, and he missed a couple. Can he get the message back on track in Georgia?
I think that the juxtaposition today between his announcement at the Board of Peace that the United States is, pledging $10 billion, and then going to a town in Georgia where, yes, we'll be looking to see how often he talks or mentions Marjorie Taylor Greene, the former Congresswoman, but in a town, in an area where roughly 20% of the population is below the poverty line, and then you're talking about $10 billion for this Board of Peace that you've created, that you're the chairman of. I just think that contrast there is going to be stark. And so if he can stay focused on the issues that matter to that community, and which is manufacturing and bringing jobs home and things of that nature, then maybe he'll fare well. But if he goes on a 95 5+ minute speech and hitting his, the highlight reel, I don't know that that really sits as well when people are hurting.
Well, it strikes me, Doug, how similar this moment feels for a U.S. president compared to 2 years ago when we were talking about President Joe Biden, who at that time was still seeking re-election and was trying and pretty much failing to convince voters that the economy was better than they felt it is, that the data was better than what they were experiencing. We know that Biden largely was unsuccessful in that. What would it take for Donald Trump to be successful, knowing he himself isn't even up for re-election? This is really about convincing voters that the party is worth continuing to keep in power.
Yeah, I mean, at least Joe Biden tried. I think, the chances of Donald Trump sticking to an affordability message in Marjorie Taylor Greene's district after he sent the FBI into Georgia to get their voter file is functionally zero. And so I think he's going to have a real struggle. And, he announced a $10 billion Board of Peace today. This is sort of this crazy vanity project. It's the Donald Trump Board of Peace, announced by Donald Trump at the Donald Trump Institute of Peace. There's some questions about whether this $10 billion that he transferred to it was actually a legitimate move of federal resources. So look, people are hurting. The president is not doing anything to lower costs for people, and I suspect he probably won't talk about it that much today.
He's apparently showing up with a deliverable here, Maura, a $600 million industrial diamonds plant funded by Japan as he tries to address moving supply chains away from China. And then it's a busy day. There is some strategy behind this. He's got the local business stop followed by a podcast interview, then the factory tour, and then the speech itself, which would coincide with nightly news if things stay on time, and they're already way off the schedule here. Maura, you spent time running communications for a former Speaker of the House in John Boehner. Is this the kind of day that you need to see on his schedule for the rest of the campaign?
I think that if he can do it, and I don't suspect that it will be a timely operation, but I do think that it's important to get on the ground, and for him especially, because so much of his focus has been foreign policy related, and his base and those who support him wholeheartedly, they need to see him out there touting issues that matter to them and actually delivering on things that he promised them. If it's helpful to Republicans in that area to have him and his presence there, then great for the GOP, and as they look forward to what's going to be a very rough midterm for him. And it does matter, even though he's not on the ballot, even though he's not running again, it does matter to him what happens in the midterms, obviously, because it dictates the next 2 years of his presidency. And so he should be taking an active role in talking about affordability and talking about housing costs and talking about supply chains and our, essentially pushing back against the stronghold that China has. If he can do that in a responsible way, in a tailored way, then that's great. But I have a little bit of doubts, Joe.
Well, the White House just kicked out a press release about the visit to Georgia today. I think it probably details what they are hoping the speech will touch on if it is read as written. No surprises here necessarily. They talk about tax relief, boosting take-home pay for working families in Georgia. There's a touch on what Joe was mentioning as well, major investments, creating jobs in the state. But the very first bullet point here is what sticks out to me, which is lower energy costs are putting money back in Georgians' pockets, noting the average gas price in Georgia right now is $2.71 a gallon, down 40% from the all-time record high during the Biden era. And we're talking about lower gas prices here at the very same time, Doug, that Joe and I are fresh off a conversation with a national security expert who notes that Iran, if attacked, could very well close the Strait of Hormuz, which is about a quarter of the world's oil flows through it. Could President Trump's geopolitical efforts actually be working against his domestic efforts in terms of prices ultimately if he does decide to strike?
They absolutely are. They've raised costs for healthcare. They've raised costs for housing. They've raised costs across the board. They haven't delivered manufacturing jobs. The one bright spot he talks about all the time, gas is going to be lower than $2. Mm-hmm. Well, I saw a report that said if he goes forward with this mission in Iran, it could spike to, a barrel of oil could spike to $90. The price could go through the roof. So not only is he working against himself, he's eliminating probably the one area where he's actually delivered real price reductions heading into a midterm that could be a real bloodbath for the Republicans.
If there's a strike, although we are seeing, to Kailey's point, movement ahead of that. With WTI back above, where were we at? $66
We're at the highest level
here
since August of last year.
66.5, up 2%. That $2.71 a gallon that they're linking to in Georgia probably won't stay that way. Mm-hmm. To your point, Kailey, how important, Maura, when you think about the economic implications, is it for Donald Trump to make a deal, to find a deal with Iran if affordability is what matters?
Well, I think it should matter in terms of what are the goals with his feud with Iran? I don't think any of us should have any sympathy for the Ayatollah. They're committing heinous war crimes and human rights violations against their own people right now, and have done so for a very long time. But I think that there is a conflict in what the intentions are with this battle. Is this to help Israel? Is this an ego fight? Is this about human rights? Is this about oil? I think there is confusion for many Americans and many people around the world about what the real driving force is here. And with these threats of saying that the strikes could come as soon as this weekend. I do think, again, to what I was saying earlier about the heavy emphasis the president has played in foreign policy as opposed to local issues, as opposed to issues that got him elected, is it's going to frustrate his voters, but also the American people when they don't see the golden age of America impacting them and only impacting those who are most powerful and most wealthy.
Well, and Maura, to that point, that is actually what is behind the fracture between him and Marjorie Taylor Greene, right? In part, it was the Epstein files, but also because she felt like he was abandoning MAGA and what the America First movement was supposed to stand for. She's been tweeting up a storm about the prospect of war in Iran in the last few days. Could President Trump actually be greeted in Georgia, in her old district, by a lot more people who think like she does and feel that way than he expects?
I'm certainly curious to see what the reception will be, and if there are more people who will speak out about, this promise that he made about not starting wars and about focusing on America first and making America great. It does seem as though, and she's pointing out a lot of things that conflict with that. And again, she represented this area, and she knows that the medium income is $50,000 or so a year, and they're struggling and they're trying to pay their bills, and to see buildings in D.C. go up with gold and marble and things of that nature, it does conflict, and it doesn't make them feel better because not only can they, sit there and take his promises and hope and hope and hope, but not see anything come to fruition. How long can they hold out for? And so I'm curious what the reception will be. Yes, I think that people are going to be excited to see him regardless, because those who are loyal to Donald Trump, there is this MAGA fever that still holds pretty true in certain areas of the country. But there is fraying and there is fracturing, and I'm keeping my eye on that for sure.
Mm-hmm. Maura and Doug, we've been talking for the better part of 10 minutes without mentioning a partial government shutdown that is now in its sixth day. It's not above the fold. It's not even on the front page. And I guess when you have one agency, maybe things go by. And we know that ICE is funded through the big, beautiful bill. But in a couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about missed paychecks for FEMA, for the TSA. Doug, in our remaining moment, this is an affordability issue as well for those families. Do Democrats risk losing the narrative when that kicks in?
There's certainly a risk because, like you said, FEMA and TSA and others can have an impact not only on those workers, but on our lives if there's an emergency. I saw a headline that said that ICE is spending something close to $40 billion buying up warehouses where they plan to host people before they deport them. As long as the issue of immigration, the way Donald Trump is pursuing it, continues in this manner, I think Democrats are going to have a field day with this one.
All right, Doug Farrar, we appreciate you joining us. Our political panel today alongside Maura Gillespie here on Balance of Power. We're going to have more on the president's remarks in Georgia, the message he's bringing, who he's bringing it to, and how it will all resonate with Andra Gillespie of Emory University coming up next. So stay with us right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's 1:41 p.m. here on Wall Street. We check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. I'm Norma Linda. U.S. stocks are declining as heightened geopolitical worries weighed on sentiment. We've got the S&P 500 lower by about 0.6%, and that NASDAQ Composite Index down about 0.6%. The blue chip Dow Jones Industrial Average down 0.7%. We have the VIX pushing toward 21. So keeping an eye on the volatility there in the market. The yield on the benchmark 10-year Treasury is just below 4.1%. That policy-sensitive 2-year Treasury yield at 3.5%. And keeping an eye on oil because it is jumping. The rising risk of an attack in the Middle East is impairing risk appetite near term. Keeping an eye on West Texas Intermediate crude at 66.38. Also, Bitcoin rising after a 2-day slump, trading above that $66,000 level. And keeping an eye on some of the individual movers, we see Carvana shares falling for double-digit losses as after higher than expected costs dented its fourth quarter profit in a sign of growing pain as the company pursues rapid growth. And over in retail, shares of Walmart also lower, down about 0.5%. This is after the company issued a full-year earnings forecast that fell short of Wall Street estimates. The retailer cited the need for flexibility amid unpredictable times for consumers. And lastly, Deere shares climbing up 13%. That's after the company boosted its annual profit forecast and anticipating a long-awaited upturn in the agriculture economy. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Nora Melinda, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, Nora, thanks. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington, and we're going to drill down a bit more on the move in the price of oil a little bit later on this hour with Mike McGlone from Bloomberg Intelligence, the senior commodities strategist, will give us a sense of what might be next with this massive buildup that's taking place, military buildup in the Middle East. The president is not focused on Iran, at least that's not the plan, as he heads for Georgia this afternoon, having spent the better part of the morning dealing with his Board of Peace in its inaugural meeting here in Washington, D.C. The destination, Rome, Georgia. The district, once represented by Marjorie Taylor Greene, that is the next stop on the so-called affordability tour that the White House has been promoting. Here's Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt.
Georgia is obviously a very important state to the president and to the Republican Party, and the president loves the people of Georgia. He'll be touring, like I said, a steel facility, and then he'll also be stopping by another local business, and he will be giving remarks on affordability, on the economy, on all of the great economic news. He's spoken about his intention to go across the country a lot more, and obviously tomorrow's trip is evidence of that.
So for more, we turn now to Andra Gillespie of Emory University, who is back with us here on Balance of Power. And it's been some time. It's good to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. Andra, as we consider this affordability message, and I would note that there is a great piece on the idea of affordability and the squeeze Americans are feeling. It's our big take piece today that can be found on the terminal or on Bloomberg.com. But it notes how since the pandemic, what used to cost $100 now costs the American family $126. It goes bit by bit to things like groceries, with flour up 40% since 2020, seafood up 23%. Medical costs, pretty remarkable as well. Nursing homes up 29%, for example. Now, a lot of this did happen when Donald Trump was not president, and yet he is president now, and it's his burden to bear. What will it take for him to be successful in turning that narrative around and convincing people in Georgia and elsewhere that actually he's doing good things for them on the question of affordability?
Well, thanks for having me. President Trump has a big task ahead of him, and I think he's figuring out that just as it was hard for President Biden to convince the American public that he had a handle on the affordability situation, President Trump is also having a trouble claiming the narrative, and he's trying to retake the narrative with this national tour and this stop in Georgia. I think he's trying to stop Democrats who have used affordability as a way to triangulate Trump policy and to point out that President Trump has not kept his campaign promises with respect to that. So I think he's trying to pivot and reclaim the narrative and use terminology that will help voters see that he is doing what he can. The problem with this is that there are the economic numbers that he can look at. He can look at how inflation was lower than expected last month, but there's also the way people perceive and how people feel about these particular issues. And so the mood isn't good. And if we look at President Trump's national numbers in terms of job approval on issues related to the economy and inflation, he is typically in most national polls underwater by a substantial amount in a lot of these polls. So he really is behind the eight ball a little bit. And I think he's trying to figure out what message will actually resonate and pierce through the malaise that a lot of people feel, because they expected, given the promises on the 2024 campaign trail, that this was going to be his top priority and that he was going to address it quickly. And that hasn't materialized.
Well, Professor, we were struck as Kailey and I were thinking back at the last time we had a chance to compare notes with you, and even further, let's say 2 years ago, the conversations that we were having about this very same issue when the president's last name was Biden. What does this President Trump have to learn from his predecessor when it comes to prices?
I think that there are a lot of things that you have to learn. One, talk is big. there comes a point at which you have to deliver. And he might be in the period right now where it's becoming less plausible for President Trump to blame everything on the mistakes of the Biden administration, right? So now that we're more than a year into his administration, this is his economy, and he's going to have to own it and take responsibility for it. Second, I mean, the thing that is unique for Biden and Trump is the fact that President Trump has, initiated tariffs on countries around the world. And so it's a question of to what extent have those tariffs not actually helped dampen prices, right? I mean, he's possibly thinking long-term about promoting manufacturing in the United States. But I think that there was, and it has always been, a larger structural question about whether or not that's in the long term a feasible plan in order to make sure that we can keep prices down in the United States. But I think just in general, right, it points to the role that governments can actually play in helping to manage the economy, and then what things are outside of their control. Like, what is the market kind of doing on its own that government intervention is not going to be able to help? And I think it's a question of whether or not government intervention can actually end up exacerbating some of these market phenomena that we're witnessing.
So, Andra, when we consider what this means electorally, knowing President Trump, unlike Joe Biden, is not up for re-election himself, but is concerned with what happens in terms of the outcome of the midterms and whether or not the Republican Party can retain control of both chambers of Congress, what is the impact on affordability likely to be on voter behavior in the midterm elections? If you're dissatisfied with the economy, are you more likely to turn out to vote against the party in power? Or are you just less likely to participate at all, knowing it isn't a presidential election year? I just wonder how we should think about the force of this, whether it's driving people to the polls or just encouraging people to maybe not participate at all.
Yeah, so the way that political scientists would factor this into modeling is actually a little bit more indirect, even though there are ways that we can make direct correlations between perceptions of the economy and vote choice. But in a lot of the models that would predict vote choice, perceptions of the economy would funnel into overall perceptions of job approval. And it's those job approval ratings that are then combined with other data like voter preferences in the generic ballot to try to predict how many seats we expect Democrats and Republicans to win in both the House and the Senate. So this is going to be an important factor that many voters consider. And for people who voted for Donald Trump because they perceived him to be better adept at handling the economy than Kamala Harris, I think the fear or the concern is, does President Trump have enough time to turn the economy around and change perceptions, or are those people going to defect? Are they going to defect to the Republican Party, or are they going to not vote in this election? Either way, that's going to have an impact on the results of this midterm election cycle.
Andra Gillespie, we've got about a minute left. I want to ask you what the conversation is on the ground in Georgia following the seizing of ballots and other materials from Fulton County, which happened at the end of January now, January 28th, when the FBI rolled into town. Tulsi Gabbard photographed. Is Georgia going to be the center of questions about election integrity once again in this election?
President Trump seems to want to make it that way. The thing about Georgia that's, really interesting is that while this is still a Republican state, there are many different types of Republicans in the state, and they hold power and compete against each other. So there are some Republicans who welcomed this raid, and then there are others who dreaded it because it was just resurfacing old issues that they were hoping were buried. And then there is the response of Democrats. So Democrats have been alarmed by what they have seen. They are concerned about voter integrity. They are concerned about the veracity of the case that's being presented and the grounds on which there was a warrant for this particular case. And then there were larger concerns about whether or not this could be used as a tool of voter suppression. This could be the potential to, has the potential to galvanize voters against President Trump and the Republican Party. And so this is something that people from the more establishment wing of the Republican Party would have probably preferred not happen.
Great to have you back with us. Andra Gillespie, professor at Emory University, ahead of the speech this evening. Thank you, Professor, for joining us. We'll have coverage of that address, which, by the way, may coincide with the late edition of Balance of Power. So do join us when we come back at 5 p.m. Eastern time alongside Kailey, Leinz. I'm Joe Mathieu with our eyes on oil. This is something that we want to explore before we hand things over to Bloomberg Business Week Daily. Kailey, where are we at? $66? West Texas Intermediate, 66.5 now. This is a 2% move today. And of course, we were talking about plumbing the depths of prices with oil just weeks ago. This march to a potential strike once again against Iran has changed the game. And we wanted to ask Mike McGlone about the latest here. Bloomberg Intelligence senior commodity strategist has been a bear on oil. Mike, is this going to end up being the peak for the year, depending on when this story finally breaks, whether it's a strike or not?
So, Joe, how did you know what I was thinking? I think that's more likely the case. We've had a bear market bounce. You know, you don't want to sell bear markets in a hole. Now, 55 was a low for the year. Right now, we're pushing new highs in the year, but it's right around last year's mean. Last year's high was 80. And the consistent trend in crude oils, anytime you get these bounces on potential supply disruption events in the Middle East, it puts in peaks. The Western-dominated producers sell forward, and prices go back downward. So I think all traders now are looking for is how high the space can it be, and when can they reset some of their hedges to increase that supply surplus on the Western Hemisphere.
Well, so when we think about that supply surplus, McGlone, is there the extra capacity in other like OPEC-producing countries to offset any supply concerns, knowing that one of the scenarios we're gaming out here is potentially that some of those Gulf states actually can't get that excess capacity out if the Strait of Hormuz is blocked by Iran? Is that not a different factor this time around?
Well, welcome back, Kailey. And that's the typical reason people use for prices to go up is some kind of blockage of the Strait of Hormuz, which hurts one country the most, Iran. So I don't think it's going to hurt too much. And we all know, Mr. President, our president has cozied up to most, certainly Saudi Arabia, but a lot of the Middle Eastern producers. We know he can bring that supply on right away. He's showed what he's willing to do to get prices lower by kind of taking over Venezuela. And what really matters for the midterms, lower prices, I think he's going to get it.
So save an interruption, and you know we do have this conversation, you're right, Mike, every time, and journalists who don't know as much as you do start writing stories about this because everybody's an expert when we go to war. Save an actual disruption, including the closure of the Strait. Is there spare capacity elsewhere to make the difference?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Saudi Arabia can come bring back on where they start to curtail a little bit out of OPEC. But the bottom line,
so we could have a protracted military operation and it doesn't actually send prices higher than where we are.
Exactly. Initially, it'll be about, okay, is there going to be an immediate supply disruption? We'll judge that. And if not, it might just accelerate the pre-existing terms. But having traded through the Gulf War, I just remember the peak kicked in right when the invasion started, even before we really knew. So if there's not a swift resolution to whatever might happen, that's a problem. But right now, this is just adding to that bear market sensitivity. How long can we stay at these high prices? Often what happens typically takes a little spike, cleanse the shorts, and then you go back down.
Mike, just quickly, as you mentioned, President Trump's desire to get oil prices lower and how you think that might be connected to the action we've seen in Venezuela. What role does Venezuelan oil play in the market now? What influence does it have?
Well, Kailey, it's part of that shift to the Western Hemisphere from Canada down to Argentina. Just U.S. and Canada alone, our net liquid fuel and crude oil exports are running 8 million barrels a day. To put that in context, when crude oil peaked at 145, we were importing about 11 million barrels a day. So it's just shifting that focus. Venezuela is adding to that trend of more supply from Canada, the U.S., Brazil, Argentina, Guyana. You see the trend there? So it's also, it's kind of made a statement. A lot of that Venezuelan oil went to Cuba, and now they're getting cut off. So this is putting kind of narrowing down Iran and China and Russia in their connections.
All right. Bloomberg Intelligence commodity strategist Mike McGlone down in Miami, Florida. Thank you so much for joining us. And Mike, of course, speaking to what we're seeing in oil, what he thinks we could see in oil, Joe, potentially, if it is lower prices, I guess is good news for President Trump, and that is one of the primary messages he wants to be able to bring to Georgia and elsewhere on his affordability tour.
Well, and certainly as we talk about gasoline prices, President pointed to $2.71, the average in Georgia right now. Nationally, we're at $2.92. And so we'll keep tabs on these for you. Incidentally, 76 degrees where Miami Mike McGlone is located today at Bloomberg Intelligence. Just let that wash over you. We've got a lot more to talk about on the late edition of Balance of Power. Kailey will be back with that at 5 p.m. Eastern Time.
Yep, President Trump might be speaking, and we'll bring you, of course, any analysis we can from his remarks right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.